Good morning, everyone. Welcome back, all those that have joined one of our webinars in the last few weeks. And if you're new, welcome along to our Cundall webinars. I'm Thomas Neeson, I'm Managing Partner, and very pleased to present, or introduce, I'm not going to present, our series of webinars that are all linked to sustainability. This is the fourth out of a series of 6, and we'll follow these on with a series of webinars on achieving net zero carbon. Today's webinar is co-working, the evolution of the workspace, and I've seen fairly rapid evolution of people's workspaces in the last 6 weeks or so. We obviously meet in challenging times, but after we get through COVID, then we will return to focus on how we're going to be building the environments of the future and the spaces we work in, and how we minimize our impact on the planet. And the way that we work and how co-working might contribute to that's going to be significant consideration in all of this. Sustainability is obviously at the core of everything we do at Cundall. Today's webinar is just one part that contributes to our published sustainability roadmap, where we're really focusing on our homes and communities, our workplaces, our projects, on providing some industry leadership, and that's what this is about today, is can we consult and advise and inform people and learn from each other. Today's webinar will be about 30 minutes long. The guys have prepared about 100 slides to squeeze in, so you'll be bombarded with information. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. There's a Q&A panel and a chat panel on the platform here. So if you've got questions, please raise them on the way through and we'll pick them all up at the end. Shona and Natalie will direct us through questions at the end. If we don't get through all the questions, we'll respond to you by email for your particular question. Speakers today, we've got a double header. We've got Mike Goslin and Andy Parkin going to take you through this morning. These two work in tandem quite a lot of the time, particularly on this issue of co-working. Mike has been delivering co-working spaces across the globe for 5 years, and he's very well versed in the art, and particularly now looking at the opportunities there'll be for co-working space going forward. And Andrew Parkin is an acoustician and a notable thought leader, talks at lots of conferences, led the ANC acoustic consultants, speaks widely on a whole range of subjects, including co-working, and will be contributing to our talk this morning. So they both will look at what was current, what we thought the future was like pre-COVID, what it might look like post-COVID. So lots to get through. So without any further ado, I shall hand you over to Mike and Andy. Enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. So firstly, for those of you that don't know Cundall, we are a multidisciplinary engineering consultancy established about 44 years ago. We currently employ about 950 people, and we are currently working out of about 950 different offices globally. But once we are back to normal, we operate out of 25 different offices. So what we're talking about today is co-working. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is. We're going to talk about how and why it has grown so much recently. We're going to talk about some of the challenges we've seen delivering it. And then at the end, we're going to offer our opinion in how co-working is going to respond to the current COVID-19 crisis. So the idea of flexible workspace isn't a particularly new concept. So traditional service offices have been around for a while. These are usually a dedicated private office with their own facilities. Co-working spaces have also been around for a while. These are generally a communal open plan area where people have access to a desk, not necessarily a fixed desk, and they share common facilities. Generally, what we call co-working nowadays is increasingly a hybrid between these two sorts of space. These spaces have a combination of private meeting rooms, own desks, true hot desks, set around a very collaborative workspace, all with shared facilities, and all leased on a flexible monthly basis. So our workforce is changing. Generation Z are coming into the workforce, and Generation Z are those people born from about mid-1990s onwards. They have been used to the internet since birth, and they expect technology in everything that they do. The other things they're looking for is things like amazing networking opportunities, amenities, and a sense of community. So their desires and aspirations have really borne out of the way they've come through the education system. So Many of them have been taught in non-traditional classroom environments. So the example on the screen here is a school, and obviously it's a far cry from a traditional school, very open plan, very collaborative learning environment. These people have then been through a university system, which again has very similar collaborative, open plan learning and teaching spaces. And they are now coming into the workplace, and they are demanding that their office space responds in a similar way. So I think it's fair to say that the office sector is changing generally in response to this, and co-working is one of those facets that the office sector is implementing to respond to Generation Z. So co-working, one of the key things about it is it's very hospitality focused. It's akin to a hotel. Co-working providers are responding to the people that use a space. Examples of this, they don't call them tenants in their spaces. Generally, they are either their members or their residents or similar sorts of terms. Co-working providers have also traditionally been offered financial flexibility to business. So initially for sort of small and medium-sized startup businesses, many of those don't want to have the burden of financial leases or owning their own premises, and co-working spaces have been the solution to that traditionally. In recent years, we've seen more corporates taking space, and again, the flexibility that offers for corporate occupiers is really important. So this financial flexibility that co-working space offers has been really, really important for small businesses over the last 6 weeks with the COVID-19 crisis. The ability to flex the size of their offering, for example, has been really important. On the flip side of this financial flexibility has been a real concern for co-working providers over the last 6 weeks because their tenant base or their membership base is so fluid. So co-working spaces are more than just offices. Generally, they have meeting rooms, breakout spaces, event spaces, gyms, cycle stores, coffee shops, cafes, you name it, they generally have it in their space. All of this is designed to give a sense of community, a sense of social interaction, and to allow all the various members in co-working spaces to interact and network with each other. Generally, co-working providers curate a series of events and try and really encourage their members to network amongst each other. And it's really trying to create these environments for these small businesses to really flourish and be creative. This data is from a survey that was done last June, so well before the current COVID-19 crisis. And it asked people why they chose to use co-working. Obviously, a large number of people chose it for the cost effectiveness and the financial flexibility it offers them. But also a very large number of people chose it because of the opportunities for collaboration with like-minded people. So many of these people would have traditionally been small and startup businesses, often working from home, from their bedrooms, and they chose over the last few years to move away from that home working into the collaborative, open plan working environments that co-working providers offer them. The key for this sector following the current lockdown is to understand how many of these people will want to return to this collaborative office environment, or how many people will want to revert back to working from home. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sector trends. So within the UK, this is the same survey from last summer, within the UK, there's currently 1.3 million people are active co-working users. And of those, about half, about 700,000 people, use a space in a co-working centre every single day. So co-working has grown fairly steadily over the last 10 years. This is data for London. As you can see, in 2017, there was a massive spike in the amount of space taken by co-working providers. That was over 2.5 million square foot of office space in London given to flexible workspace. There was a similar number in 2018, and the first half of last year, which is where the data, where the most recent data is, was showing that we're on a similar trend. So in 2018, the flexible workspace operators accounted for the largest proportion of take-up in central London. That was 18% of office take-up. And also in 2018, it was the second year in a row where we reached over 2 million square foot of area leased to co-working providers. Traditionally, co-working spaces have been around small and medium-sized businesses, startups, entrepreneurs, and so on. But in recent years, we've seen more and more corporate entities taking space in co-working offices. Some of the reasons they do that are around the financial flexibility it gives them, the ability to expand and contract teams, project teams, for example. But probably more importantly in the corporate world, it's about allowing some of their more creative teams to move out of the corporate headquarters feeling buildings into the innovative, collaborative environments of a co-working provider and allowing their teams to really innovate and flourish. So the previous charts I showed you were for London. London is one of the two main co-working hotspots around the world. But elsewhere in the UK, we've seen a similar trend in our regional cities. A relatively small uptake from 2013 onwards. And then in 2017, there was a major spike on the number of spaces being given to co-working and flexible workspaces. And again, that trend continued in 2018. If you look at the breakdown of those bars, it's clear to see that both Birmingham and Manchester are both significant co-working hotspots in the UK. Slightly more widely around Europe and the rest of the world. As you can see, New York and London are the two cities with by far the most co-working space in their office stock. But equally, there are significant co-working offers in Beijing, Amsterdam, and many of the other major European cities. So co-working spaces bring with them a series of technical challenges. So if you understand those technical challenges and are discussing them early on in a new build, they can be relatively easy to incorporate, but they can become even more difficult to incorporate if you're trying to accommodate a co-working provider in an existing office space that hasn't been designed for that purpose. Most of these technical challenges revolve around the fact that the brief for co-working providers is to occupy at 1 person per 5 square meters. That is a number that their financial modelling has determined needs to be the case for their business case to work. And it remains to be seen how in the world of post-COVID, with the increased social distancing, how this number will actually pan out going forward. However, historically, it has always been the number that we have designed to. So if you compare that with a traditional office building in the UK, which will probably have been designed for 1 person per 10 square meters, possibly 1 person per 8 square meters, you can see it's a significant number of additional people. So additional people generally means additional desks. Additional desks generally means additional small power requirements, and therefore we see that the electrical requirements go up by 8 to 10% for co-working space. Now you may be lucky and there may be spare capacity in the infrastructure to accommodate that, in which case that electrical demand increase is not a major concern. But if it starts triggering major infrastructure upgrades, then it can become quite expensive. Additional people generally means additional water storage. And what we generally find is if you double the people, it doubles the amount of water storage requirements, and it may add circa 70% to your water plant room down in the basement. Now again, if this was a new building and you were designing the basement from scratch, it would be relatively easy to accommodate that. However, in an existing building, trying to squeeze that additional water storage capacity in can be a real challenge. Twice as many people generally need twice as many toilets. Co-working providers do try to minimize that by sort of sharing toilet facilities across floor plates, but invariably we end up putting in additional toilet facilities. Landlords tend to respond to this by giving them capped services connections and allowing them to install it as part of their fit out, but generally that is what happens. Co-working spaces can have a real impact on lift performance. So typically a lift in a new building might be designed for 1 person per 10 square meters. In older buildings, it might be 1 person per 12 square meters, or even 1 person per 14 square meters. As you can imagine, people occupying at 1 person per 5 square meters can have quite a detrimental impact to the performance of those lifts. Now, historically, the view was always that because these people were entrepreneurs and startups, they didn't necessarily work traditional office hours and therefore didn't necessarily impact the peak lift traffic performance. But the more and more corporate occupiers that are going into these spaces, the less that assumption holds true. Fire strategies for office buildings in the UK are typically designed around 1 person per 6 square meters. Staircases and exits are usually sized based on that occupancy. When a co-working provider wishes to occupy the space at 1 person per 5 square meters, that obviously puts pressure onto that fire strategy. We've had a number of examples where we have been able to be involved in the fit-out process really early on during the design, and have allowed us to basically incorporate additional measures into that co-working fit-out. For example, additional fire compartmentation lines, which has allowed an effective increase in on-floor capacity and has made a space that was previously not suitable for a co-working provider to be occupiable by them. Probably the single biggest impact we find from a co-working provider on a building is the amount of ventilation. In the world of post-COVID, all the evidence is suggesting that the ventilation rates need to increase. So all the things I'm about to say are going to be exacerbated post-COVID. But to date, we've been working on the basis of 1 person per 5 square meters. So when you compare that to BCO, that would typically have 1 person per 10 square meters, 12 litres a second per person, plus an allowance for meeting rooms, so around 1.3 litres per second per square metre. BCO might typically recommend 1.6 to give a variety of system choices and flexibility going forward. But when you look at a co-working brief, it will ask for 5 metres square per person and probably 10 litres a second per person to comply with building regulations. That gives a ventilation rate of 2. So that's significantly more than what most office buildings have been designed to date. For a new building, again, it is relatively easy to solve if you're designing the building, but we do find it adds 50% to the plant area and to the riser spaces. For an existing building, it becomes even more challenging. There's only so much additional capacity you can get out of systems. There's only so many places you can bring extra air in from outside, and so on. We have managed to mitigate this in a few examples by using demand-controlled ventilation, so CO2 sensors and varying where air is in the building. But inevitably, this is one of the biggest challenges that co-working spaces offer. Flexibility of space is really important to co-working providers. It's really important they can be adaptable. They can adapt to the market trends, whether that is demand for different size space or to respond to things that are unexpected, like this current COVID-19 crisis. Now, the key to allowing for huge amounts of flexibility is to design for it from the outset. Generally, what we do is we lay out the services in these spaces to suit the maximum possible cellular layout of the space. We always then install all the partition bulkheads, and that allows us to install those, to route the services through them, to do all the difficult acoustic ceiling details at the construction stage. And this then allows partitions to be installed and removed really easily, with only a requirement to simply recommission the lighting and the services. Lighting can be a bit of a challenge for co-working spaces. So we always work by lighting the task areas, but generally in co-working spaces we have multiple different task areas. So we try to light different task areas in different ways. In the same way as it's important for the partitions to be really flexible and easy to change around, the same applies for lighting, and we're very careful to select products which are easy to reposition, and ideally products which are easy to automatically recommission as and when the floor plates change. The other thing that we see in co-working spaces is that the working plane is quite often at multiple heights during the day. So you have the sit-stand desks that move around during the day, and it's important the lighting responds to these differing levels. In some of the collaboration spaces in co-working areas, you tend to use the vertical surfaces for collaboration and pinning things up, and that puts more emphasis on getting good vertical light distribution on the vertical surfaces, which is rarely considered in typical office design. So we talked earlier about the importance of technology for Generation Z and how they want technology to be everywhere. And it is really important through co-working spaces that the integrated technology is seamless. It's really important that people are able to work anywhere and at any time. And the key to that is usually having really robust and resilient Wi-Fi everywhere. To allow people to be working in their private office, come out into the kitchen space, down into the reception area, down into the meeting rooms, and just have seamless Wi-Fi connectivity throughout that journey around the building. Tenants change regularly, as we've talked about, and it is really important that the IT interface is very plug and play. New tenants come in with their new IT equipment, and it is really important they can just plug it into the system and it works first time. AV interfaces in meeting rooms are also a real key to the user experience. Everyone has different devices. Some people have phones, some people have iPads, some people have laptops. It's important that you can just plug it in and you can see how those meeting rooms are supposed to work intuitively and with very little hassle. Mobile phone coverage is always a very interesting challenge in co-working spaces. Not all modern buildings have good mobile phone coverage. However, particularly with small startup businesses and entrepreneurs, they make a lot of mobile phone calls. WeWork in Moorgate, when it opened, was over 3,000 calls a day via the mobile network. And generally, we find that we end up having to boost the mobile network in buildings to give an adequate coverage of mobile phone signal. So I'm now going to hand over to Andy, who will take us through the remainder of the presentation.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Right, I'll just steal access from Mike. So we're going to talk about acoustics, and also we're going to talk about some of the factors that affect the co-working environment, and looking forward as well to where things might go from here. So acoustically, co-working spaces are a challenge. Like all things, challenges are there for engineers to work with, and they're just our considerations need to be given to the various factors. I'm trying to advance the slide and struggling to do so. Oh, here we are. So what we have in co-working is generally a bit of everything. And from an acoustician's point of view, all the things that we know about workplace design happen in co-working. You've got this hybrid situation. For those of you who are not familiar with how a co-working office might look like, you've got a mixture of big open plan spaces which could be there as working, they could be there as a restaurant, there could be touchdown spaces, there could be the reception areas. There might be some presentation spaces which could be used for product launches or third-party presentations in the evening, but then people might want to go and sit in there in an atrium in the day and do their work. And if you're a brand new startup, you might have one desk that you hire, and you pay for that on a weekly or monthly basis. But then as you grow, you might want 3 or 4 desks, and that kind of then lends itself to wanting an office. So you might want an office which is big enough for 4 desks. And then there are other offices which might have 6 desks, 10 desks, 15 desks, 30 desks, 40 desks. So once you start getting to offices of about 10 desks plus, essentially you're creating an open plan office. So you've got lots of smaller open plan offices arranged in an environment where essentially they become cellular offices next to other open plan cellular offices. So you've got the best of both worlds. And if you think what is the importance of acoustics in an office? Well, it's all about speech communication. Can you understand what is being said by other people or not? And that is then tempered by the requirement for, do you need to understand what other people are saying or not? So in your own little co-working bubble, in your office of people who work with you, you will need to collaborate. You'll need to be able to understand what other people are saying. And so you need to have the reverberation controlled adequately within that space. You need to have the signal to noise ratio, which means that you can hear what's being said over the background noise, and to be able to have communication within that space, as well as a degree of privacy, so you can do your own thing. But then when you go to the next door space, you don't want to be unduly affected by what they're doing. So you want the sound reduction in place so that what comes through the partition between you and next door is of minimal significance and doesn't either detract from your privacy or speech security or your ability to do what you need to. And so that's where the partitions come in. But as Mike said, we're in a very flexible space. We need to be able to change those partitions relatively quickly as well without too much disruption. So it's entirely plausible that we will need to be able to close up shop on a Friday. On Saturday, someone comes in, takes a partition down, puts another one up somewhere else. On Monday morning, you've reopened a different space. That's how co-working works, to flex, to keep the people in there as they go through their corporate journeys. Flexibility generally in acoustic terms means compromise. If you have a movable partition, if you have a partition which is demountable, generally it will not perform as well as one that is fixed. And so we have to cater for the fact that we may lose some performance along the way. And so speech masking is really helpful there. Speech masking is an artificial way of piping sound into a space. Generally, it's a wash of sound that you don't even notice until it's not there anymore. But what it does, it raises that noise floor so that if you've got sound coming through from next door and your sound is up there, if you can get a noise floor somewhere near it, then you'll reduce the ability to understand what other people are saying. So that's a really helpful tool. The other thing is that we need to look at the internal finishes within the space to control the reverberation. And we need to do that on a flexible layout as well, so that when the partitions move, the reverberation control in there also enables you to have the same amount of reverberation control in a smaller or bigger space. So the picture there shows like a gridded raft, regular centers. That's very typical for a co-working space. And then thinking back to what Mike was saying earlier about how the Generation Z, who we tend to be designing for mainly, are used to not working in silence. In fact, silence is something that they're not particularly familiar with, or maybe don't even thrive in. So to have the right mixture of a buzz of energy in the space, as well as being calm enough to be able to do what it is that they need to do. So balancing these things is quite a challenge. So what is the future for co-working? What is the future for working? There's so many people talking about these kind of things at the moment because the world has changed. The world has changed within the last 6 weeks. We're talking a lot recently about what COVID-19 has done. It's accelerated the inevitable. It's also changed the future to a certain extent as well. And I think the companies who survive the best through this crisis will be the ones who adapt the most and adapt to the way things are changing and even influence the way things are changing. So there's some interesting stats here. A snapshot in time between March 16th to March the 18th seems like a lifetime ago now, but that was in the week before lockdown. Lockdown happened around the 20th, 23rd of March. In a two-day period, co-working started to grind to a halt. Over 70% of events were cancelled. Almost 70% of meeting room bookings were cancelled. A lot of membership subscriptions were cancelled. People changed. People started to call in sick, either by being sick or worrying about other people being sick, and things started to slow down. And then what we now have is that co-working just isn't working. Just like most offices, they're on lockdown. They might have a skeleton staff, if anything, but generally they're not working. So how are we going to get people back into that environment, and what is that environment going to look like? Well, we don't know, is the honest answer. But what we do know is some facts, that the facts that we have based on the science that we know, that will help formulate how things will look. As Mike mentioned earlier, that the whole co-working model is predicated on a very dense occupancy, dense occupancy within the space. It's 1 person per 5 square meters. But that directly contradicts the modern requirement for social distancing. How can you maintain a safe distance of 2 meters apart from someone when you're crammed in a relatively close packed situation? We've been talking a lot recently about lifts. And what about lifts? You can be 2 meters apart from someone in a lift, but you are still in a confined space with them. All these things, there are new considerations that we've never had to think about before. But we are learning a lot about airborne viruses. It's good to leave these things to the scientists. It's quite dangerous to make suppositions and off-the-cuff suggestions, so we're not going to do that. But what we do know about airborne viruses, as Mike mentioned, ventilation is the key. If we can dilute and evacuate air in a space, if a virus is airborne, then logic says it will last a much less time in the space, and we can get rid of it. So that's good. Humidity also is really important. Keeping humidity within a set boundary is very good for people in terms of their ability to breathe, but also the ability for viruses to not thrive and last for too long. Airborne viruses are airborne, as it suggests, but also they land on surfaces, and surfaces become dirty, so areas need to be cleaned. And so we need to be looking at people's reliance on touching things. So we mentioned lifts before. How can you operate a lift without touching anything at all? How can you open doors without touching anything at all? How can you operate taps and even flush toilets without touching anything at all? These are all new challenges that are going to come through. A lot of it is an adaptation of old challenges, but the materials that we use using antimicrobial surfaces is going to be more and more prevalent. Using brass and other metals, which are proven to have antimicrobial properties. Changing our cleaning regimes, deep cleaning, using UV light to clean things. Light is another interesting one, in that it's been shown that if you have strong daylight in a space, then airborne viruses will stick around for less time. They won't be able to survive as long. So with all of these things, we have engineering challenges of physically being able to do them, but then we have financial challenges of making the financial model that predicates co-working still stack up. And these are all challenges. And so we've been talking for ages about health and well-being. Those two words have gone together for the last 6 or 7 years, real buzzwords. But really, it's been about well-being, not so much health. And so we've been designing buildings for well-being for a long time. And even in the context of co-working, most co-working spaces will have a well-being room, which will be a yoga room or some kind of gym. But then we've been designing buildings using the Well Building Standard. And One Heddon Street there is the Crown Estates co-working space, which is a well platinum space, so the best of all worlds really, and showing how you can get the ultimate space for well-being and have co-working in there as well. We've designed our own offices for well-being. We've ascribed to the Well Building Standard. We were the first in Europe to get certification for our One Carter Lane fit out in London, and we've been rolling it out across the world as well. And that's led us into all sorts of things, and we're monitoring things in our offices, and it's really important to know what's going on in a space, and that's going to be more and more the case as we look in a post-COVID-19 world. Is we once we know what environmental conditions are best or worst for these airborne viruses to be eradicated in or survive in, then we need to look at keeping in those parameters. And the only way we can do that is by measuring those parameters. So measuring the amount of airflow, measuring the temperature, the humidity, the light levels. And we can do all these things, and we can display them on dashboards. And if you've been into one of our offices, you'll have seen a dashboard there, normally in reception, showing all these different factors. And I think that's going to become more and more of a thing. But we talk about climate emergency and the fact that we are in a dire situation on the planet because we're using too many resources, and we're leaving an everlasting imprint on the planet, which the planet will not recover from. And so we've got a climate emergency, but really what the last few weeks have shown us is that we're also in a health emergency. And so we've got a dual-pronged attack, really, that we're having to mitigate and design against. We have to design against the fact that we cannot operate in a way that we have done previously in terms of our responsibility for the planet that we live on. But also we have health issues which we need to combat at the same time, and find a way of doing these things in tandem, because they're not mutually exclusive. And so we've been taking a look back at the Wellbeing standard, which is, as I say, something that we've been looking at for a number of years and supporting a lot. And actually, the Wellbeing standard is interesting because it's based on a load of health research, and the health research showing what people need physically and mentally to have a healthy lifestyle and a healthy environment. And we can learn a lot of lessons from this as we look at COVID-19 and other airborne viruses. Because when we look at the respiratory aspects, and we see what our body needs to be able to flush itself out, what it needs to be able to be healthy, and to look at the light and all these things, it's a lot of it's already there in this research. And if you're so inclined, you can go onto our website and onto our blog site, Cundall Conversations, and we published an article on April the 9th, looking at all these various factors and looking at what it might mean to us as we progress into a post-COVID-19 world. And so, what does it mean for the co-working sector? Well, we need to change the way that we've been doing things. And ask questions. Well, will the occupancy be the same as it always has been? Will people be working from home more than they have been? And I think the answer is yeah, these things will change. And as Mike was saying earlier, we're dealing with a group of people who would normally be working from home or working on their own or in isolation somewhere, who've then come together in a very social environment. And now, because of the COVID-19 outbreak, they've all retreated back to their home environments. What is going to coax them back into that environment? And I think there's two things there. One is that the environments in the offices will need to change to make their safety and their health of paramount importance. But the other thing is there'll need to be an evidence of that as well. There'll need to be things that the residents can see. Whether it's as simple as having dashboards displaying what the environment is, or whether there are other interventions and they're physical interventions that they can see and take comfort from. And it may be that the sector goes through a complete evolution and ends up becoming completely virtual. Co-working providers have provided a physical curation of space where people can get together. Will that eventually become a virtual space where people are brought together digitally rather than physically? We don't know. These are all things which are up in the air. But whatever trends there were towards co-working before the first quarter of this year, all bets are off now. Things have changed. And so, just to bring our session to a close, just to bring you some information on forthcoming webinars. We've got a webinar on overheating in residential on the 6th of May, one on office lighting, health and wellbeing on the 13th of May, and a two-parter on getting back to work post-COVID on the 11th and 18th of May. You're very welcome to all of these. There's a constant evolution in our thoughts and our discussions about how work is changing and how it needs to change. And so please join us on this journey as we together come to some kind of solution for what the future will look like. We keep using the phrase a new norm and a new normal. We don't know what that looks like yet. We're getting indications of what it will look like, but that is a moving picture in itself. So please join us as we look at these things. And so we're all looking at designing in a post-COVID-19 world, and hopefully we can get there together safely and with healthy futures. So thank you for your time and attendance, and open to questions. Shauna.
Yeah, so we've had a couple through. The first one I have here is, do you think co-working providers will continue to thrive post-COVID?
So I think I'll answer that in two parts. I think first of all, it will depend on their model, their funding model. Some of the co-working providers, don't have huge financial assets behind them and may simply be unable to, be unable to survive the fact that they have very long lease obligations upwards to their landlords, but their tenants are very flexible, so they may simply just go out of business. Other co-working providers have a much more asset-backed funding model, and they are much more resilient and likely to survive. I think the ones that will really thrive are those that adapt. If people carry on and doing the same as they've been doing before, then they're probably not going to thrive. It's people that respond to this COVID-19 crisis well, do something different, are seen to be doing something different for their residents. They're the ones that are likely to thrive post COVID-19.
Great, thank you. And we have another one from John Sands. So do you think we will see more active engineering systems, ones that can react to the needs of the space rather than the traditional fixed performance systems, to help meet the challenges described going forward?
So I think in short, yes. I think ventilation seems to be the real key one. So I think ways to sort of enhance that ventilation rate and respond to what's going on in the space will be really important. I know we've talked a lot internally about whether natural ventilation would be a good idea, and that would almost allow people to have their own control of opening windows to dilute the space of their own free will. I think lighting has been the other one we've talked about. Whether there's different sorts of lighting systems that can be used to respond to the space in certain conditions to help control COVID-19. So something a bit more around UV lighting, for example.
Great. And the next one we have is: do you see co-working as a help or a hindrance to buildings achieving ambitious net zero carbon energy targets?
Interesting one. So I think for a mechanically ventilated building, they do tend. I would say they tend to be a little bit of a hindrance. They are increasing the intensity of services that you need to use. They are increasing the electrical supply capacities. They are increasing the amount of ventilation energy you need to use. However, I would counter that and say that if the building is designed properly for co-working, the SFPs and things on the ventilation systems are down at the lower levels. We think carefully about the small power that we allow for co-working spaces. We design for good natural daylight. We design for good natural ventilation. I see no reason why they can't be, very good, low carbon buildings. But the challenge always tends to be when you've got an existing building and you're trying to effectively cram a co-working provider into a building that wasn't really designed for it.
And the last one I have here is: does the emergence of cheap sensors facilitate a much more demand-led control? Does the emergence of cheap sensors facilitate much more demand-led control options?
Yeah, so I think we're working with a few co-working providers looking at their sensor offers at the moment and how we can best do that. I think there's clearly a lot of sensors in the market, and a lot of people are looking at how they can help their spaces. We've already talked a little bit about demand-controlled ventilation as one way of sort of helping to get ventilation to the places that you need to deal with things like airborne viruses. I know a lot of co-working providers are very keen to get the right level of technology in the space and not just pepper the space with sensors that actually have no benefit. So yes, there's lots of cheap sensors out there on the market, but I think it's about understanding which ones actually have a benefit. Andy's talked about the importance of sort of monitoring internal air quality and internal conditions. So maybe we're going to be focusing on sensors that do that rather than other elements.
I think that there's a cautionary tale as well in that the more commoditized we make sensors, the cheaper they become, and potentially the less accurate they become as well. I'm very dubious about people are using now their watches to measure sound levels and to try and get some kind of sensible result from those. They're horrifically inaccurate, and so you've got a twofold issue, which is kind of symptomatic of the whole censoring. You've got something which is a really inaccurate sensor and an unskilled person interpreting that inaccurate information to say something that it shouldn't ever say. And that is the risk with commoditization of sensors, that people will abuse the information or just not understand it and then come up with something which is inappropriate in response. So we do need to be careful with that and measure the right thing in the correct way and do the correct things with the results that we get.
And I have one last one here before we wrap up, which is, how do you think the role of interior designers should adapt to the increased need to integrate the physical with the virtual co-working experience, be it from home, a shared space, or elsewhere?
I think it's a collaborative approach, because the response to all of these things it's an engineering, it's a health and well-being, it's a digital response. And so the only way that we can get truly great spaces is by everyone working together and complementing one another. What we can't afford to be doing is everyone going off on their own directions. We've all got to work together. So if we can get spaces that work really well, sound great, feel great, look great, give you that right sense of belonging, right sense of well-being, then we've won. The problem is if we all go and invent our own things, which come out with a bit of a Frankenstein's monster.
Great, that was all of the questions I had, so thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy your days. Bye.